his plan was to take his little tape recorder and sit down with his dad on his father's front step and interview his dad about his life, maybe for an hour, ask him questions. And this would be a way of honoring his father, which again was part of honoring himself as his father's son, his father's only son. Anyway, that whole thing happened, and that began a new relationship with his father, because as he said, he had said in 1985, okay, no more, like no more am I the wounded son of daddy. Now, as a young warrior, I'm going to be like, a young man honoring his father as best he can. And the thing that was interesting is that even though this process began, it was still a painful process. Louis would still, in spite of all of his efforts, he still, for the longest time, it would actually take him almost 20 years longer. Well, it's in 1990, it'd take him 15 years. It wasn't until 2005 that Louis could do a completion piece with his dad, but we'll save that for later. But he began the process here in 1990 of healing this core wound, okay, in his life. Similarly, it's so fascinating how this happened, because, okay, so Louis was, this is now late 1990, Louis offering some volunteer counseling at this center that was supported by a fellow David Winton, okay, in Minneapolis. Louis was giving this as volunteer work. He had a client come in, this young woman, that told this story about this ordeal she was going through. She was the secretary for this same person, David Winton, who was funding this sort of open door healing center. She was his secretary, and one of the jobs he had given her to accomplish was to hire a new chef chauffeur for David's mother, Catherine Winton. And she was a very difficult person, and blah, blah, blah. So the woman was just kind of sharing her personal dilemma about this process. And Louis listened, and Louis had this knowing that he was supposed to take this job as the chef chauffeur. So he waited until the end of the therapeutic hour. After they de-rolled, he said to this young woman, he said, this might sound really peculiar, but I had a very strong inclination when you were sharing the story that I was supposed to take this job. And she looks at Louis like, really? So I think she was quite fond of Louis. So I think they'd had a few sessions together. Anyway, she set up an interview for Louis with David Winton and his wife Penny. So here, a few days later, because I think there was kind of an urgency, because the matriarch, Catherine Winton, wintered in Florida, but she had fired her former live-in chef chauffeur, this woman, and they'd always hired sort of middle-aged women to take this job. So here's the young man interviewing in David Winton's office. This is the wealthiest family, okay, in Minnesota, and probably one of the wealthiest families in the United States. So, the office on the top of the IDS tower, the penthouse, Louis sitting there with David and his wife Penny, and they're just having a chat, and like, you're a well-educated young man, la, 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 la. Why would you want this job? Typically, we hire this, like I say, this middle-aged woman to live above the garage on the house in Deep Haven and the quarters down in Florida. It was just so peculiar because, again, I'm watching this whole thing. I'm orchestrating this whole thing, Sun King. And here's like this sort of improbable, if not impossible, improbable situation. Why would they hire him? Because they kind of asked him, like, you know, why would you want this job? And it just came to Louis to say, well, you know, I'm a writer, and especially, you know, this idea of going down to Florida, because they thought he would just be bored to tears. There's nothing to do other than just make the 3 meals. And Mrs. Winton, the matriarch, she was 98 years old. She didn't have a very active social life, so there wasn't going to be much driving her around, much entertaining, much of anything. Just the two of them sitting for 3.5 months down in Florida in this house on the beach. And so Louis just said, well, I have this writing project in mind. It would be perfect, you know, 4 months to just have nothing to do outside of making Mrs. Winton's meals to write my book. So I remember David looking into like Penny, and they're like, well, he seems like a nice young man. Why not? So they hired me, or Louis, and within a few days, because they were waiting, I think it was already into like early January, perhaps. And usually she went down in late November and was down there for the whole, you know, longer winter. So Louis packed up a few things and they flew him down there. I guess they flew together. I remember it's kind of cute, Louis never having an experience of this in this lifetime, but remember the connection to his last lifetime. This family was so wealthy that instead of having their driver drive their Lexus down to Florida, they flew down and just rented a Lexus for the whole winter. Can you imagine how much it cost? It was so funny because this is so new and Louis hardly knows Mrs. Winton at all. But they go into the rental car place and, you know, Mrs. Winton has to sign the form and show her ID. And this young girl behind the counter of the automobile rental place, she's looking at Mrs. Winton's ID and she can't quite fathom because it shows her birth date was like 1887. Like she couldn't fathom someone that old. Anyway, it was very cute. The whole thing for Louis was this amazing. You know, at the time he wasn't putting these pieces together, but those of you who have listened to the earlier talks recall that Louis did a past life regression and he was part of the J.P. Morgan family. In fact, it was likely he was J.P. Morgan Jr. He was had this deep love for his friend Shenani and also a deep affection for the Chinese gardener. And, you know, in that lifetime, he ached to be connected with the servant class. These were like really happy people. And the people in his class, these elites, these were not happy people. And he was not a happy person. As an older man, he was an alcoholic and died a tragic death and had a horrible marriage to another banking family's daughter. And this is, so now he's in the Winton family. Okay, the Winton family, the Wintons were, along with the Warehousers, they lumbered all of the Pacific Northwest. And Catherine's father was the president, the owner of the biggest bank, you know, now Bank of America. Then it had a different name, but so he's found his place that he'd looked for, right, in the past life, to be a servant. He just really enjoyed, you know, the idea of being a servant for a wealthy family was much more enjoyable than being a member of the wealthy family. You know, most egoic structures, they would think, oh, are you kidding? It's much more enjoyable to be one of the elite. And in fact, that's not true. Louis saw the other side. So here's this karmic return, bringing things into balance. He saw how miserable these people, the elites, are. Mrs. Winton, he asked her, once, like, listen, Linton, why do you change your clothes for every meal? She put on a new suit, and she always had to buy all her clothes from the Oval Room, Dayton's Oval Room, because, you know, back before there was like easy access to designer clothing, you had like your local designers making you these suits, these elegant suits. And so Louis asked her, what, you know, 'cause we're down in Florida. The only person she sees all day is Louis. And so he asked her, why do you change your outfit for every meal? She goes, well, that's just what is done. And on occasion, I think probably maybe like once a week, she would go to the country club in Palm Beach, of course, where there were members, and, you know, to have lunch with a friend. You know, she didn't really have and so many friends anymore. At 98, she's kind of outlived all her friends. But that's just what is done. So it was very cute to see this kind of little prison that they live in, and Louis was pretty amazing. It was also fascinating. This was part of Louis's karmic thing, working out, you know, because his mother had perhaps too much affection for him. And so here now is this 98-year-old woman who more or less falls in love with Louis. She becomes very affectionate with Louis, always wants to walk with him and hold his arm. And at the time, you know, this is part of the new warrior thing. Louis is like smoking cigars. And in Florida, but also back in their home in Deep Haven, Minnesota, they would walk around I forget what you call it, but the big circle in front of the house, the drive, walk, you know, she'd hold his arm, and Louis, she always wanted him to smoke a cigar because that's what her father did, and that's what her husband did. And again, she became very enamored with Louis, and she would tell everybody. She was, of course, getting a little bit dotty. She just had no inhibitions anymore. She would tell anybody. And so Louis oftentimes would escort her to events, and he would meet Hubert Humphrey and, you know, the Pillsburys and the Daytons and all the wealthiest people. She would have to go to any of these social events, like opening of a new wing of the museum or whatever, which her family was paying for. You know, again, the super, super wealthy people. And she'd introduce Louis. There's been 3 men in my life: my father, my husband, and now Louis. You see everybody whispering like, oh my God, what's going on with Kay? What's going on with Kay and this 38-year-old Louis? Very, very funny. But it was fascinating. It was fascinating for, again, Louis to be on the inside and have this thing that had happened to him in his former life, him being the elite, being in love with his servant, and now here's this elite person being in love with him. It caused quite a problem, her affection for Louis, because the daughter, David's sister, Margaret, I think her name was, she was very, very jealous, very suspicious, right? Because now she's in her karmic stuff. Her mom had never loved her enough. And now she's watching her mom love this servant, this chef chauffeur, Louis. And so she caused all kinds of problems and eventually would get Louis fired. But Louis was in this thing for almost 2 years, 1.5